Democratic primary against Brian Whitney, 66, 34%. You know, usually wears a hat. You guys can't do it if he doesn't wear a hat. Let's just start. Would you introduce yourself and tell them why you want to do this?
Well, thank you. It is a tremendous pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you for joining us for this debate. I look forward to your questions. I will note I'm wearing a blue shirt. I am a founding member, or was a founding member, of the Huelskamp Club in my hometown of Fowler, Kansas, when I was in 6th grade. And so we have any Royals fans here today. I also have a daughter at Hutchinson Community College, and so I like the blue as well. But it is, I'll tell you, coming from a little town of Fowler, Kansas, town of 500, it is an amazing honor and responsibility to serve you in Washington, D.C., and I think it's a real indicator of the openness of our government, that folks from a small town out in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. I'm a 5th-generation farmer, grew up on a farm, never expected to get into politics, but I've had a great opportunity to do that. Married my lovely wife, Angela. We have 4 kids, and didn't have to travel very far to get here. And but one of the easiest decisions of serving in Congress, one of the first ones we made, was to make certain we keep a congressional office right here in Hutchinson to serve you. Also have offices in Salina and Dodge City, and then a new one in Manhattan, and that was added to the congressional district. And have a number of staff here unofficially that do work for you. But I tell you, when I talk to Kansans all across the 1st District, even across the state, they're worried. They're worried, and they have a disquiet about them, worrying about what's happening to their country. They look at what's happening in Washington and see nearly $18 trillion of debt. Since this president took office, there's been about $7 trillion added to the national debt. And that can't go on forever. And if you look at my voting record, you show I'm concerned. And it's not generally about the folks in this room and the national debt and ever-growing government. It's our children and grandchildren. I think it's wrong to borrow money today and then try to make our children and grandchildren pay that off. So we've been working hard on that. I serve on the Small Business Committee. It's great to be here at the Chamber today because I've been working hard fighting for small businesses. And I tell you, the largest corporations in this country, they have all their lobbyists. They get all their tax helps and subsidies, but it's the small businesses. It's the small businesses that are most concerned about Obamacare. The small businesses most concerned about too much regulation coming out of the EPA or the USDA or OSHA or take your pick. It's the small businesses that are worried about growing in an environment that if you have over 50 employees, you get hammered under Obamacare. I also serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee. And folks say, hey, what have you done lately in Washington, D.C.? And I'll say, working on the VA committee, fighting for our veterans, we got something done. And I spent 3 years so frustrated by folks from the VA, bureaucrats coming before the committee saying everything was fine. But then we heard from veterans, 500 different veterans across the 1st District, saying, you know what, the VA isn't taking care of me. Our benefits are waiting too long. Their secret waiting list. And then we had that scandal that we saw at Phoenix. And we went to work. And it took a bipartisan effort, but we got something done. And on November 5th, for the first time ever, veterans in rural Kansas and throughout America will have a choice now. In many cases, they'll have a choice where they can get their health care. Instead of making them necessarily drive to Huelskamp, maybe they want to go to the local hospital. Maybe they want to go to a local clinic and get their care. We were able to work together and get some things done. There's so much more we can do. We can get this economy growing. We've had 6 straight years of a flatline economy, ladies and gentlemen. Let me tell you, it doesn't have to be that way. If we can pass the right policies in Washington, D.C., that'll free up our entrepreneurs and free up the economy and our small businesses to continue to grow, we're going to see some fantastic things. And Kansas, we're well situated, particularly with growth, potential growth in energy economy. Hopefully we'll have some questions on that. But it's been a real honor to serve you and work hard in Washington, D.C., fighting for those values we hold dear here in Kansas.
Wow, he hit 5 minutes. Mr. Sherow.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here in Hutchinson, my birthplace, and I thank the Chamber for hosting this event. Richard Shank, thank you very much for your kind introduction earlier. Martin, thank you for doing your work here and entertaining us before. And I want to thank my wife for being here, Bonnie, getting up very early to be here, and she is a great supporter. One of my daughters is here. I have 4 daughters, and I did used to have hair as well. But it's very meaningful for me to be here in Reno County. This is my ancestral home. My great-grandparents homesteaded near Nickerson. My grandparents, Joe and Rose Sherow, ran a general store in Langdon. Rose was a pillar in her community and led the efforts to put together a modern school system around the turn of the century, last century, for that community. I was raised in Mays, Kansas, a small farming community when I was a kid. I worked my friends and my family farms. I learned the lessons that all of us as young Kansans learned: hard work, honest day, work. And I was part of my family tradition as well to serve in the military. My great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. My father was a World War II veteran, and I'm a Vietnam-era veteran, having served in the Air Force. And I came out of the Air Force with fantastic GI benefits that helped me with my schooling at Wichita State University. Better GI benefits than any of the returning veterans who I see at K-State coming back to pursue their education. And education is very important to me. It is why I became a historian in the first place. And I wanted to know about my family's stories, which were centered in Langdon. And that's what got my interest in trying to understand what it means to be a Kansan, what it means for small towns to grow, and in some cases, like Langdon, to perish. I've had the fortune of teaching 22 years at K-State, teaching the great history of this state to thousands of students now. And what I've always tried to do is something that my father wanted me to do. He said, "Son, make sure that you leave a place better than you found it." And that's what led me into public service, besides teaching at K-State, to try to make a positive difference in my community of Manhattan. I learned how to work with others regardless of party lines, regardless of their economic interests. And as mayor, we achieved some fantastic results in Manhattan as a result. Building the Flint Hills Discovery Center, expanding our airport, 5 jet service now in and out of town a day, complete downtown redevelopment, the building of the National Bio-Agro Defense Facility, putting together the first regional council of 15 cities, 7 counties that have been put together in 7 years. These were results that came from working together to make a difference. I've devoted my life, my education, my career to service in this state. Working together, we know we can get things done. So as we listen to the differences today, look to see who offers solutions, not blame or excuses. And as we go forward, I want to thank you again for having me here today. It's a privilege to be in front of you. Thank you.
Okay, now I understand the way this works is that I thought of some questions. Audience members are bringing up questions. It may take me a minute to ask them. Hopefully it won't. They'll each have 2 minutes to respond to them, and we'll just kind of see what we can learn about. Okay, let me start. Thank you. With a question about immigration. Everyone talks about it. We've heard about fences and all that. What do each of you support in the way of immigration reform that would be, this is a Chamber of Commerce crowd, that would be least damaging to the businesses of the 1st Congressional District? I mean, one thing to say, we're not tying up immigration. there are jobs out there that need to be done, they're being done by legal immigrants. So what's the best way to deal with immigration, realizing you're in the 1st Congressional District economy?
And Mark, that's an excellent question, and that's one of the problems I see with Washington, D.C. They have a hard time getting along. And the Senate did pass a bill that I think has it backwards. And so I say my first priority is what you have to do first, and that's the number one priority in terms of immigration, is you have to secure the border. That has to come first. In 1986, when I was a junior in high school, they got it backwards in Washington, D.C. They gave amnesty at that time to 1 million folks, and President Reagan signed the bill, and they never secured the border, which is why we're sitting here today with such a problem. And so the House position is similar to my position. I just wish they would bring out the bill that would secure the border. We did specifically in late July when we were dealing with this issue, where the president, you might recall, in 2012 issued an amnesty. If you fit a certain category, you were under 18, and you came across the southern border, the president said you got amnesty. As a result, we had thousands, up to almost 100,000 young folks streaming across the border. In July, we said we need to solve that. We need to use our resources to secure the border, and we need to assist the states at the border, and we need to do away with the president's executive amnesty. The Senate, as is very common, they didn't take up the bill. Actually, we have almost 50 bills that I believe are job-creating bills that are sitting in the Senate today. And so that's one of the problems in Washington, D.C. And with you, when you have a Senate controlled by Democrats, House controlled by Republicans, we can send bill after bill over there. But first, you got to secure the border. Secondly, our second bill in the House is helping make certain we have the workers we need, particularly for the industries here in Kansas, particularly for agriculture. We have a broken system from the 1950s. And I'll tell you, I personally understand that. I have 2 daughters who are immigrants. We went through the immigration system. It is a real mess. It needs to be streamlined. It needs to become part of the 21st century, and we can make those reforms. But until this president secures the border, it's hard to move forward.
Thanks. Mr. Sherow.
Certainly, we need to secure our borders. There's no question about that. And also, I think amnesty is not the solution either. But we do know that there's a significant workforce already at play throughout the 1st District, and especially in the southwest portion of our district, in the cities of Liberal, Garden City, Dodge City. Right now, the school district of Garden City translates 20 languages. 20 languages. 4 full-time translators. And that's because people are seeking an economic opportunity that Kansas is providing for them. They're coming from all across the globe, just not from Mexico or Latin America. This was very apparent to me when I was in Huelskamp, and they're desiring a legal workforce because the jobs are there. I've seen the economic growth that has occurred in Liberal as a result of immigration there. Empty storefronts now are full of entrepreneurs. They're adding prosperity and economic growth to our state. And so what we need is to have an immigration bill very similar to the one the Congressman talked about, Senate Bill 744, that is now languishing in the House of Representatives. It does provide funding for securing the border. It does provide a pathway for citizenship. An onerous one, by the way, is not easy to do. But why isn't that passed? Why isn't Speaker Boehner bringing that to the floor of the House? And part of the difficulty is he can't control his own caucus. And part of that is because of the divisions in that caucus between the Tea Party and the regular Republicans. But I can tell you this, if he brought that bill to the House floor, it would pass. Because there's enough moderate Republicans and Democrats who would put that into law.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, some of the questions coming in from you folks, I've kind of blending them together. One came in that just, when will the administration stop flights from West Africa into the United States over the Ebola business? And that, with another one, should we be sending our military overseas to deal with this? Is that a military type
I'll be happy to
Neil,
answer.
where do we start?
I'll start with you.
Mr. Sherow.
Sealing off flights from Africa isn't going to stop things. It's not going to stop Ebola from coming here. The testing that can be done, people can show up at the airports, show no sign whatsoever of being infected with Ebola, and then several days later be showing those symptoms. What has hurt is that the sequester has cut $60 million from the Center for Disease Control's budget. And then an $88 million vote comes before the House to support our efforts to stop the spread of Ebola in West Africa. And that bill passed by the House was not supported by our congressman. And that to me is very important for national security, is to stopping the spread of Ebola where it is most prevalent. Also, there's been no increases in the National Institutes of Health. And the director just recently said, had he had the funding that he's been requesting, they would be well on their way to a vaccine for Ebola. We can cut and cut and cut, and sometimes when we do that, we are lessening our ability to protect our own national security. And that's not sensible budgeting in any way. So I don't know about you, but I certainly don't have a hazmat suit hanging in my closet.
What do you think?
I think today, yesterday, a week before, and a month ago, this administration should have banned flights from the Ebola-infected countries. That just makes sense. But when you have a CDC director that says somehow that's going to contribute to the spread of Ebola, that makes no sense. And actually, Republicans and Democrats alike are both challenging the administration. And this makes sense to secure and seal the border, no more flights. And there is rumors, and hopefully it will not be confirmed today, that we could have an Ebola case here in this state, and which shows that there is a lot of work to do in Washington, D.C. But one thing I want to make clear from my opponent, there has been no cut in the CDC funding. There have been no cuts. There's been a $3 billion increase in spending in the last decade. And there was no Ebola vote in the U.S. Congress, as my opponent just said. What we need is leadership. And what the administration has done is they've transferred $1 billion out of the military budget to combat Ebola. And that's where 90% of the funding is coming from. But until you say no more flights from Liberia, it makes no sense that we leave ourselves insecure. And additionally, what we're seeing and hearing from the administration and folks looking from the outside is our local hospitals, in many cases, and we're unprepared because the CDC didn't provide a proper direction. And so we look forward to, I had my wife last night, I said, well, why can't you stop the flights coming from Liberia? I said, that's up to the administration, that's up to the CDC. But today, as we sit here, the director of CDC says, no, we're going to continue those flights coming from Ebola-infected countries. And that I do definitely disagree with the President of the United States.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Again, we're in the 1st Congressional District. Broad topic, agriculture. We have foreign markets for Kansas agricultural products that are very strict on importing genetically modified food products. Where are you on labeling food products that they've been genetically modified? Is there a way to allow modifications to food, to work something out with foreign governments, foreign trade partners that will let us produce the most efficient crops we can and still have foreign trade? Is it?
Yep.
There you go.
Yeah, great question. In my opinion, since about the 1500s, we have been working in science to enhance and modify the things we produce. And when we're going to feed a growing and hungry world, number one, we have an obligation to do that if we can. And number two, it's a tremendous opportunity for Kansas farmers and ranchers and all the associated businesses. One of the favorite parts of my job, and there are many of those, is being an ambassador for Kansas agriculture. When Japan said, you know what, we're going to lower our restrictions on Kansas beef going into Japan, they called my offices, let's come down and celebrate it. When the country of Vietnam had a brand new ambassador, and he wanted to see how we grow pork here in this country, he called my offices, Congressman, I'd like to come to the 1st Congressional District, because we want to import more pork. And when we passed free trade agreements to open up more trade to Panama, Colombia, and South Korea, what that means is a better living for those folks and more money in the pockets of Kansas. And so we've been pushing hard because we believe, I believe, that we can help feed the world. We've been doing that for years. I admit I'm a little biased as a 5th-generation farmer, but we have tremendous growth potential. And we need to continue to push forward. We need to continue to promote that. And I also had a chance to sit down with the ambassador from Taiwan. They have a different name from him for his position, and it escapes me now. We said, hey, he understood why GM crops are so important, because they can't raise enough food to feed themselves. China can't raise enough food to feed themselves. They're buying our stuff. That's a great thing. That's a great thing to continue to export. And when you live here in Kansas and raise corn, wheat, soybeans, and also you raise a lot of cattle here in Kansas, you need to push and promote exports. And doing that as one of only 12 farmers in the whole entire U.S. House, it's a great opportunity, not only for us, but I believe for the entire state.
Yes, just a quick corrective here before I answer that question. The National Institutes for Health over the last 10 years has lost 23% of its purchasing power, regardless of this very small percent increase in its budget. At K-State, the researchers there are doing tremendous work in genetically modified crops. It's a leading institution in the world for this kind of research. And it's bringing about tremendous advances in agriculture for Kansas farmers. And there's a lot of fear-mongering going on in international markets about the benefits or the liabilities of GMOs. We got to do a better job of explaining the science behind GMOs and how they work for farmers, but also how they work for consumers and food production. K-State researchers, who I'm very familiar with, understand that in just a decade or more, we're going to have to double food production in order to feed the hungry mouths of the world. That's going to put a lot of pressure on farming here in Kansas. And we got to do the best job we can to produce the best crops, the healthiest crops, and get those into international markets, and do a good job of marketing those. I don't think we've done a good job of explaining to our European trading partners or our Japanese trading partners just how beneficial these crops are and how they can help feed their populations as well. This is very important. It will help food production in Africa. It will help food production in China. We got to work on this, and we need to do it sooner than later.
Okay. We'll move to water for a moment. Ogallala Aquifer is kind of drying up on us. Is there a role that, or position you would take in Congress to pull the federal government into managing this resource? Or is that a bad decision, a bad idea? What can you do as a member of Congress to make sure we have water west of 81? While they're drinking lattes in Johnson County, we need water for crops and animals out here.
Well, thank you, Martin. That's an excellent question. The vast majority of my research and writing has been on water issues in Kansas. In the Ogallala, you talk to farmers throughout the 1st District, and they all tell you the same thing. It's a matter of time before we're going to switch to dryland farming, because we're basically mining the Ogallala. There's no question about that. Everybody knows it. That's just a fact. So the question is, how do we extend that resource to have the greatest life expectancy, and then do the kind of research that's being done at K-State that will lead to the kind of crops that are drought resistant, that can be dryland farmed and still have an abundant production level. We got to put together research and conservation at the same time in order to work toward a future that's going to be very different in 40 and 50 years than the one we're seeing right now. Already wells are going dry in Scott County. Already Russell and Hayes have serious water problems. These things are going to only intensify over the years, not abate. So we better start planning for those now. The role of the federal government, I don't want the federal government in here regulating the Ogallala Aquifer. This is a state issue. It needs to be settled by state people, bureaucrats, farmers, politicians, researchers. We all need to come together, consumers, in order to plot out that future. It is very important that we work together. Forget about party lines. This is resources that are crucial to life here in Kansas. We need to work together to get that done.
We found something we can agree on. We don't want the federal government controlling Ogallala, so I appreciate that, Professor. But let me tell you what we can do.
What time is it?
Yeah, what time is it? Let's make note of that there was an agreement here. But let me tell you what we can do. And in the past, I've also been very active in the state legislature promoting conservation. For many years, for decades, since 1945 and the water act here in Kansas, there's been an idea that use it or lose it. That doesn't make any sense. There should be incentives to conserve and incentives to save. That's why I wrote a Water Banking Act to give some folks an incentive to save and conserve that water for the future. And so there's a long ways to go, but one thing I will want to point out, there's not just a well or two going dry, and that didn't just happen. That started 20 and 30 years ago. There are portions of western Kansas which were irrigating in the 70s that no longer irrigate today, what irrigated in the 1980s, because high volume pumping went away. And so the state and our water engineer, or our chief engineer, are very behind the times in terms of adjudicating impairment issues, but it's critical, not just to western Kansas, but to the entire state economy, because so much of agriculture is centered around irrigation. Our beef industry is centered around making certain there's access to a lot of corn. But one thing we can do in Washington, number one, make certain that the Arkansas compact is fulfilled and the Nebraska compact is fulfilled, that the folks from the north and the west send us the water they're supposed to do, and our Attorney General just does a great job on that. But additionally, in foreign policy in Washington, D.C., we have to make certain that we don't provide incentives to overpump the aquifer, and I think that's occurring now. We need to look long-term. That's the problem in Washington, D.C. They look next week, next year, instead of looking to the next generation in terms of our policy.
Okay. Okay, well, another way to go. Okay, there's a question from the audience. I'm going to kind of blend some of the other questions about the same thing together. Given the wind energy production tax credit has expired, thus wind now receives no tax breaks. I presume that's happened. Do you favor restoring the wind tax credit, or should tax breaks for oil and gas be repealed or trimmed to keep the marketplace for energy at a level? Do we level them out somehow through tax policy? You understand that what? Probably better than me, but okay, here we go.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I appreciate that question. For over 20 years, the federal government has been subsidizing the wind industry, and I think there was maybe an argument to start that, but somewhere along the lines, and this is the problem in Washington, D.C., they like to subsidize forever. They like to make certain if you're a special interest that you get a select provision in the tax code, and this just happens to be one of those. I firmly believe wind energy can compete. Ethanol can compete. But we don't need some folks in Washington, D.C. to say, hey, you know what, we're going to give you a 40% tax break. And actually, wind energy, even if the federal tax provisions would expire, there's still plenty of state and local provisions. There are preferences for wind-generated electricity. But what we're looking for as we move in the future, and then I signed on to a bill that says, you know what? Make them all compete. I don't care if you're a big oil company, or a big wind company, or you're a global corporation. I don't think you should get a specific provision in the tax code. But that raises an issue, specific to the question. We need a fundamental rewrite of the entire tax code, because it has been put together for years and years, because special interests like what's in there. If you want to get our Kansas economy going again, you want to get the national economy again, growing again, make sure entrepreneurs don't have to call their accountant to see what the IRS is going to tell them today, but make certain they are able to work in the marketplace and produce goods and services that people want. We can get our economy growing again. That's probably one of my biggest frustrations about Washington. You've got Democrats and Republicans all saying, yeah, we need to change the tax code. We need to do away with an IRS that targets political opponents of this president, but then they won't bring a bill to the floor. But I tell you, I'm pushing, I'm a Republican, push Speaker of the House, let's bring it to the floor. Let's have that debate, whether it's about wind energy, whether it's about oil and gas production, whether it's every other provision in the tax code, because we want to make certain the average American businessman and women, the average consumer, get a fair shot in Washington, D.C.
Thank you for that question. The renewables in this state and in the 1st District are critically important to the future economy of Kansas and also to national security. Already, we look at ethanol production, 11 plants going on here in the 1st District. It looks like they're producing nearly 16,000 jobs altogether, over $1 billion in wages. But yet when the renewable fuel standard is put to perhaps a test, our congressman wants to do away with that. At the same time, the president of the Kansas Farm Bureau, Steve Baucus, is on record saying that's short-sighted and that the congressman doesn't understand the agricultural markets in this state. And the ethanol producers are very concerned about having that pulled out from underneath of them just as they're getting those industries up and running. The same thing for wind power. Nearly 9,000 jobs are associated with wind power in the state. It's a growing industry. Only the ones that were grandfathered in with the tax credits are still receiving them. Any new ones going up are not receiving them. They're working in the open market right now. And this is very important because wind power can produce nearly all of the energy that's needed here in Kansas. It's already producing nearly 20% of it, and can produce a large portion of it for the United States as well, so long as we have a smart grid. These things are very important to the future well-being of Kansas. While at the same time we need to work to make our fossil fuels work for us, be cleaner and more efficient. And we can do both at the same time.
Okay. Let's go back in history a year or two. Remember earmarks? I think we do.
Yes.
We remember earmarks and appropriations bills for a representative from a small state like maybe Kansas, maybe the 1st District, could either by just negotiating and being nice, or by being kind of a pain that you could deal with another way, could get earmarks in bills. We could get a bridge. In Kansas, our bridges tend to go someplace, not no place as they have in earlier times in Alaska. Yeah. What do we need to do about earmarks? Would they help the 1st District? I mean, there's this idea that, everything, there's this kind of cultural idea against it, but practically for the 1st District, could we get stuff here if we could get earmarks? If you were either, persuasive enough or just enough of a nuisance that people would give us earmarks to shut you up. Where do we start? Okay.
Earmarks are an interesting thing. Of course, supposedly they're not done in Congress anymore, but I think that's putting a fig leaf on the issue. They're actually done, but they're done in different kinds of ways now. They're done with one congressman calling another and making suggestions. They're called phone earmarks now. They're done in different kinds of ways. And what I learned as a commissioner and mayor of my city is that one person's earmark that benefits his district or his city is another congressman or woman's pork. And so the question is, how do we put into place those kind of things in the budget that are going to be needed in your district without resort to these informal earmarks, which seem to be all the rage in Congress right now? If we're working for the airport in Manhattan, how do we do that? How do we work to create that kind of legislation and weave it into the budgets that are going through the House of Representatives? This is an important question that really comes back to affect communities all throughout the First District and in the state. So how do you work with others to do that without the abundant support that earmarks at one time represented?
One of the biggest changes when I first took office was working with my fellow Republicans in a new majority to eliminate earmarks in the U.S. House. And I supported that effort. I was active in that effort. And because I don't think politicians should be picking winners and losers and giving handouts to that business and that campaign donor. And so that went away. But what hasn't gone away is the administration doing that very same thing. That we see that particularly in alternative energy industries, and where certain industries, certain donors get very large loans or very large grants. And so I agree with my opponent, that still continues, but it happens in the administration. But at the end of the day, you have to make the case for a project. It doesn't get stuck in there because you know somebody. We've had far too many you know somebody projects. Well, one thing that wasn't a you know somebody project was the MBAT project that's moving forward at K-State. I was in the state legislature when we first started working on that. And we worked on that. The governor worked on that. At both parties, we had governors working on it. We had members of the delegation. I went up there, we worked with the whole delegation, and we're moving forward on that because what we have said and what the federal government has understood is we need to protect animal agriculture from bioterroristic threats. And that is why you see that project continuing today, because we made that argument, not because somebody knew somebody on the Appropriations Committee was able to slide it in. The thing about earmarks is it's not written anywhere. They were doing it on the slide. But we did away with that in the U.S. House because we wanted to make sure government worked for the ordinary people, not just those major campaign donors that were getting earmarks for years after years by both parties.
Okay. We're getting probably relatively close to a decision on same-sex marriage in Kansas, believe it or not. Some people consider it a moral issue, but that aside, or should that even be put aside, is there something that the federal government, which has already started equal treatment of same-sex spouses for benefits and the like, ought to do to help Kansas do the same thing with state employees here?
Ladies and gentlemen, the issue of same-sex marriage was decided in the state in 2005. We amended the state constitution. What we see today are unelected federal judges imposing their will on the state of Kansas, or attempting to do that in state after state. 30 different states have taken a very clear position. The Supreme Court took a very clear position in June of a year and a half ago. What they said was the Defense of Marriage Act, Article 3, which was signed into law by Bill Clinton, voted for by Joe Biden, is the law of the land. Now, you wouldn't hear that by the media reports on that. But the federal Supreme Court said states get to make that decision because we are a federalist system. But when you allow one judge, two judges, or a panel of three judges to come in and impose their will. That's when you start hearing from Kansans worried about what exactly is our authority. Some unelected judge can impose their view. My biggest concern about this and the imposition of same-sex marriage, again, by unelected judges, in the Supreme Court's non-decision is its impact on our culture, its impact on our families, its impact on our children. I firmly believe marriage should be between one man and one woman. We should be promoting families. We should be promoting marriage. I just saw a report last night, marriage at an all-time lows because we don't respect marriage. And whether it's the federal government, state government, local government, your churches, and your communities, we need to do more to promote marriage and promote families. And I'll say this to the men in the audience. If you're a father, there's an absence of fathers in our society. And that is a real epidemic and a tragedy in our society. And there's not much Washington can do about that. But to say personally, whether it's for my 4 children or children you might have, is we need to be better parents. And that's why I think we need to promote better marriages.
Thank you. Having unelected judges is a cornerstone of American justice system. It was the unelected judges who ended discrimination in the public schools in Brown versus Board of Education. Sometimes the courts overreach, sometimes they don't. But for me, I believe in equal rights for all Americans, in equal protection for all Americans under the law. That's been a hallmark of my positions while I was a commissioner in Manhattan. I'm for equal rights for all Americans and stand against discrimination in any of its forms. When I was sitting on the city commission, it's well known that I supported some of the strongest protections for people of differing sexual orientations. Look, the U.S. Army does not discriminate on sexual orientation and recognizes spousal benefits in that essence. Kansas State University has a non-discrimination ordinance for the same very reason. And so how did that make sense to me that my brothers and sisters who are fighting in the Army, who are different sexual orientation, can put their lives on the line and then come back to Manhattan and then be told, you don't need to be in this restaurant. I'm not going to rent my apartment to you. How is that embracing what we stand for as a nation? And it doesn't hurt Manhattan either. We're the fastest growing and most prosperous city in the state right now. And if we look at the way religious leaders are going, the Vatican right now is saying that same-sex couples can offer good things to a community. We're seeing not only the state move in a different direction, but also the world.
Thank you.
Yeah. You can do that for both of them or one or the other at the end of this thing. They'll figure out which one you're clapping for. Let's go to something that talk for a little bit about the deficit. But let's start off not talking just simplistically like we're high school girls here. Let's, the United States has like a $17 trillion deficit. We're all brought up better than that to have that sort of debt. But practically, that's all we hear from candidates for Congress is about the deficit. We're the world's largest economy. We're not going to get foreclosed on. It sounds reasonable to reduce our debt, but is it something we have to do quickly? Is it something we have time to do? Is it something that actually we need to worry much about? And it's kind of broad, but we're the biggest guy in the room. I think we start with you.
One of the things that I constantly hear is that the deficit is out of control, that the debt is growing. There's two things about this. One, the deficit is coming under control. it's now a smaller percent of GDP than it's been in the last 15 years. The debt, while it still is growing, is rising at a slower rate than the growth in the national GDP. What that means simply is that it's easier for our national economy to absorb it and deal with it than it was in the past. But is there still a need to deal with balancing the budget? Yes, there is. And you cannot do that just simply by slashing and cutting taxes and also slashing and cutting spending. We see how that's working here in Kansas. What I would be in favor of is adjusting the revenue side and also the spending side. Both of those need to come into play. For example, I'd be more than happy to lower the marginal tax rate on corporations so long as they actually pay taxes. When Exxon gets by without paying taxes, something is wrong in our system of taxation. So I'd be more than happy to see it close down from 35 to 15%, so long as we actually collect that. In the 64 largest corporations in the United States right now, on average, only pay 8.1%. I pay a little more than that. But there also needs to be spending cuts, sensible ones, and you can even start in Congress. Why in the world should congressional aides be paid for lifestyle coaching? That costs American taxpayers $2 million a year. It doesn't sound like much, but you need to start somewhere also on reductions.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's not be easily misled. Our national debt is a grave threat to our economy. It is not getting smaller. The debt is the accumulation of deficits. But this is a long-term problem. Both Republicans and Democrats in Washington, as Martin said, have been saying for years they're going to do something about it. But I will say in the last 6 years, massive deficits, over $1 trillion. And that happened under President Obama and Nancy Pelosi in Congress. That's where it was. Since I've been up there, we have begun to reduce the deficit, but it's still over $500 billion. And to me, it's not just the fact we're taking money today, spending it, and telling folks yet unborn that you get to pay the bill. That's a real moral question. We have to start doing something about it. I think it's a real life threat to our economy. But I will identify that I have supported a measure that went through the House that would put us on a path to balance in 10 years. And almost every single member of my opponent's party said, no, we do not want to balance in 10 years. The president actually proposed a budget that would balance never, would suggest we're going to run perpetual deficits forever. That's not possible. You can't do it in your family. You can't do it in your business. You certainly can't do it in the chamber. You have to balance your budget. I think we need a balanced budget amendment. I voted for that. I supported that. I don't know about my opponent's position, but one thing I would want to say that doesn't help the deficit is Obamacare. It adds to the deficit. It slashed Medicare by $716 billion. And my opponent said just last week, that didn't hurt anybody to slash Medicare. That's hurting our hospitals and hurting our seniors. And also, when we're now taking on ISIS, the idea that my opponent has proposed, which would be to cut the budget on the backs of the military, I think that's wrong as well.
Thank you. Okay. Now we're at wrap-ups. Okay. And it's 5 minutes or 4 minutes? 5 minutes? Okay. You don't need to take the full amount of time. But put your best face on and tell these folks just very practical. And remember, these are business folks, largely. You know. Tell them why they need to send you to Washington. Which one do we start with? There you go.
I want to thank everyone again for being here today, for the chamber hosting it. Martin, thank you for the job you've done. I want to clarify a couple things real quickly. My opponent, yes, is concerned about that $700 billion cut to Medicare, but it's exactly what's in the Ryan budget that he also voted for. And that $700 billion is also prorated over the course of 10 years, and it's a reduction in spending, not in benefits. Do not be fooled by that. Medicare recipients will receive their benefits. It's this kind of thing that is disturbing to me when facts get distorted. And when I've been told, I want to slice the military. I have gone to Fort Riley. I have been with the commanding generals there. I know who goes to protect our interests overseas. I've seen those young men and women. And it's not on them that I want to see those budget reductions done. It's on an airplane, F-35, that has cost us over $1 trillion and doesn't fly and can be shot out of the air by Russian jets. That doesn't make any sense to me. But paying our soldiers enough so they're not on welfare, so they're not on food stamps, that is important to me. Take care of people first. My opponent has demonstrated some failed policies. He has been taken off of the Ag Committee. While he says he supported MBAF, he did not vote for the budget that included the MBAF funding. You can't have it both ways, to say you support something and then not fund it. That's not possible. I have a proven track record of working with others to bring about concrete results in Manhattan. Any of you who have been there 10 years ago or 15 years ago will see some tremendous differences in the city. And it's because we put aside our differences as much as possible to work together. I worked well with the chamber. I worked well with people of different political parties, different interests, the community, to bring about those results that we see in Manhattan. Now by the Census Bureau, the fastest growing city in the state, the 10th fastest growing metro area in the United States. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because we could come together to resolve issues that made Manhattan prosper. And that's what I want to do for the 1st District, is to come together, work together, go to Congress and work with other people who disagree with me to bring about that common ground, to find it, so we can move this nation forward and address the questions of debt, address the questions of national security, address the questions of global threats from pan-epidemics. During a congressional hearing, my opponent once said to a VA employee, when a bureaucrat fails at their job, they should be fired. No excuses allowed for failing veterans anymore. Well, I think the same holds true for a congressman. When a congressman fails at their job, they should be fired. No excuses allowed for failing the big first. I want to thank you all for being here today, and I ask for your vote on November 4th. And if not, at least please get out and vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for the pleasure and opportunity of working as your congressman for the last 3.5 years. And I tell you, I think one of the problems, and there are a lot of those in Washington, D.C., are folks that just get out of touch. They spend more time in Washington, more time playing politics, more time doing something that's about tomorrow rather than the next generation. That's why my home's in Kansas. That's why I come back every weekend. That's why I do 250 town halls, because the responsibility of the elected is to listen and say, hey, what do we want? And when I listen to Kansas, here's what I hear. They're worried about the future. They're worried about government. They're worried about the EPA. They're worried about their health care. They're worried about a border that's insecure. They're worried about Ebola, and we still have flights coming from Ebola-infected countries. And they say, isn't anybody thinking up there? Where's the common sense? Now, I'm one of only 535. But what I try to do every day when I'm in Washington, D.C., is to inject a little Kansas common sense, some principles, some long-term thinking of how do we solve this deficit problem? How do we solve a spending problem? How do we solve a healthcare problem? How do we secure a border? Actually, I think a lot of the solutions are actually, they're not grand. They're actually pretty simple. It's just that Washington has been broken into partisanship and to status quo for far too long. That's how you can end up with nearly an $18 trillion deficit. And you have politicians of both parties say, hey, it's okay. You can run $500 billion of spending more than you're taking in. You know we can't do that. But I tell you, Washington doesn't want to change. If someone comes up there and says, you know what, let's re-examine the tax code, both sides get upset. If you go in there and say, hey, let's look at our $3.5 trillion budget and see where we can save money. Let's look at every line item, which, by the way, the president said he was going to do as well. Well, you can't do that, they tell you. If you say, hey, let's look at the fact that food stamp spending has quadrupled in 13 years, oh, we can't talk about that. You know, ladies and gentlemen, we must talk about that. We must talk about our values. We must talk about our future. And my opponent mentioned the VA. That's where we did talk about the future. That's where we did say the bureaucrats that came to my committee for 3 years, and some of them lied and said, don't worry, Congressman, we're taking care of our veterans. Then we found out what happened in Phoenix. Then we found out what happened in Wichita. That's why I jumped in my vehicle from Hutchinson and drove to Wichita and said, are you taking care of our veterans here in Wichita? And we found out they were not. And so working together, Republicans and Democrats, we took on the VA, took on the scandal, took on 320,000 bureaucrats. And let me tell you, there's 320,000 folks that work there, and most of them are doing a great job. But they're intimidating, they were harassing, they were covering up, they were getting bonuses for doing a poor job, and we said, stop! And we finally passed something. The president signed it. It passed nearly unanimously. Same thing on the fact that NSA, and we haven't talked about that. You know what? They've been spying on your phone calls and your emails for a number of years. But until we found out about it, until we were informed actually by the media, we went to work, Republicans and Democrats. So in the House, it took 2 years, we finally passed some protections and said, you know what? Let's focus on the terrorists rather than going after ordinary law-abiding Americans instead of going through their cell phones. So we made some progress on that. But ladies and gentlemen, it's not easy. Because particularly small businessmen and women, I hear it again and again, they fear that their ability to be entrepreneurs and to share in that American dream, to pass on their business to their children and grandchildren and grow that business, grow the economy, they fear they're losing that ability. And it's not because Washington hasn't done enough. I'm telling you, it's because we've done too much and gotten in the way. I mean, it doesn't mean we can't solve these problems. It doesn't mean they're easy. But I'll just assure you that if you re-elect me, I will continue battling for the 1st District of Kansas, continually battling for our rural way of life here in our small towns. I tell you, it's just still unbelievable that in America we can agree and disagree on these things. But one of the toughest part of my job is to write a condolence letter to a spouse or a child of someone who's lost their lives in Fort Riley. I just want to say, for those veterans that are heading over there, they deserve a strategy, they deserve our support. And let's forget the politics and support our soldiers in Iraq and Syria today. So thank you, God bless you, and I appreciate your support. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming. This was kind of, I don't know, hope it worked out okay for everyone. Remember November 4th vote? Nice thing about voting for these guys. Yeah. You may not have to prove you're a U.S. citizen to get a ballot to vote for them, the way that we find voting in Kansas now. Thank you very much. Do you need to close up?